in chapter 6, verses 32 through 38. And that's on page 838 in your Pew Bible. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. But love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High. For he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure you give back.
Old First Church on the Common. Now, as I said, we've been there before in the stories I've shared in the past. Some of you may remember some of the members of the parish. Remember the clearing committee and Lucille McDonald. And we learned a little bit more about the community of Rock Haven. Jeanette and Pappy Holman lived in the little trailer up on the side of the hill. And Imogene Reynolds and her sister Beth and some others in Rock Haven, also members of the church. This morning I want to talk about Old First Church itself. Old First Church sits on the high ground on the south, on the west end of the community common in Rock Haven. The story goes that the church is situated thusly on the west end, facing the common, so that the front doors of the church will be facing east, which is very significant theologically, if you know. And it's there. The story goes that it's there to face the east, to face the rising sun, and on that great day of reckoning, as Joel will put it, to greet the rising of the sun, S-O-N. Even though the gospel tells us that no one will know the hour nor the day, the folks at Old First Church on the Common know they will be at least looking in the right direction. Truth be known, Old First Church was built there because the quarrymen who brought in the split granite stones for the foundation left them on the wrong end of the common. And the church fathers at the time didn't want to pay the extra money to hire them to move them to the right end. So they just built it where the stones were. Old First Church has been on this location since the days when the cattle could be seen openly grazing on the common. It would have been a familiar sight. The congregation has had a place on this end of the common long before other denominations moved into this town. And in subtle and not so subtle ways, these Johnny-come-latelys are reminded of that. Their first building was the typical framed rectangular meeting house. In the early years, it served as the town meeting hall, a rally place for local politicians, as well as the social center of the community. That building burned to the ground during the winter of 1878, or was it 79? I'm not sure. The records were lost in the fire. But what we do know is that the new building was dedicated on July 4th, 1879. This new building, if you can imagine, was designed in the English Gothic style, which was so in vogue at the time, and it was the pride of the community when it was built. The English Gothic sign has those fake buttresses that go up the side, you know, and it has the beautiful gingerbread fascia on the front of it, and tall, elongated, very narrow stained glass windows along the side. And the towering steeple. The steeple reaches so high into the sky that occasionally clouds blowing in off the Gulf of Maine will obscure the rooster weather vane perched high on its peak. Why there's a rooster up there and not a cross, I won't go into. But like the church location, let's just say there's the mythical theological story behind it, and then there's reality. Well, underneath this lofty vestibule the lofty steeple is the vestibule. And just inside the doors of Old First Church on Sunday mornings, you'll find Jim. Jim is a spry fellow for his age, always quick with a laugh and ready to share the latest joke with a few of his cronies. Dressed in his Sunday finest, cleanly shaved, a good splash of vintage Old Spice cologne, neatly folded handkerchief in his suit coat pocket, and a fistful of bulletins. Jim is ready to welcome the community of Rockhaven into the Sunday service at Old First Church on the Common. Jim has served on just about every board and committee at Old First in his several decades of church membership. Every committee, that is, except for the Women's Gospel Society. Jim has also served in the community in a number of ways. Most recently, he sat on the board of Water and Sewer Works. Let's just say Jim knows all about the comings and goings. As I said, every Sunday, for as long as most current members can remember, Jim has been there at the church doors. Well, except for that time his wife took ill suddenly on Sunday morning. He had to rush her to the emergency room. And yeah, there was that time when the sewer line broke in front of Harry's Market. But even then, Jim was able to make it to church. He came in right after the sermon, as I recall. Thankfully, Jim took the time to go home and change. But for all practical purposes, every Sunday, Jim stands inside the great oak doors of Old First Church, and he keeps a careful gaze over the gathering congregation. Typical Sunday morning might sound something like this. Ah, good morning, Miss Susie. How chipper you look in that hat. We remember Miss Susie from maybe a couple of stories ago. She lives out on Slaptown Road with a 3-room shack with no indoor bathroom. A few men from the church every fall would work up 8 cords of firewood for Miss Susie to see her through the winter. Never married, she struggled throughout her life with seasonal work at some of the local canning factories and plants. Now she is well known for her bountiful gardens and her wonderful relishes that she makes with just about every vegetable in her garden. Miss Susie smiles, takes a bulletin, and makes her way down to her usual spot, 3rd row back in front of the lectern. Well, look, it's little Bobby Flanagan and his sister Elsie. And how is Mrs. Flanagan today? Bobby was born with ventricular septal defect, or hole in his heart, and was not expected to live for just a few weeks. And here he is, starting school this year, Old First Church's walking miracle. Mrs. Flanagan never did go back to her maiden name after her husband left just before Bobby was born. He just disappeared. She did hear from him through an attorney when he filed for divorce a year or two later. But Bobby smiles as Jim hands him his own bulletin. Bobby gets his own bulletin. It's one for adults, but he gets his own, and that's important, that he gets his own bulletin. And even though he can't read, little Bobby likes to draw things on the bulletin. And occasionally, Pastor Williams will find some of Bobby's masterpieces left in the pews. And he gives the Reverend a chuckle to see how a 5-year-old artistically regards the pastor. Hello there, Jed. Walking up the steps is Jed Carlisle. Jed has worked for the Department of Highways for years now. Jed is known as a hard worker, but on more than one occasion, old Jim had gotten that early morning call from Jed. He had to drive over to pick him up from the county lockup. Well, Jim thought to himself, at least I've never seen or smelled any evidence of alcohol on Jed on Sunday morning. They talked briefly about the road project going out on the Pine Plains Road, how long that will take, and who's doing the job. And Jed finds his way after he gets his bullet over to the north side near the second stained glass window. The one that says, given to the glory of God and the loving memory of Jacob L. Storrow, Esquire, first deacon of Old First Church, 1784 to 1839. As with so much of our history, there's a story there as well. Goodness gracious, how nice to see you, Mabel. We have missed you. Have you been traveling? Mabel Bradley and her husband Robert live in one of the grand old homes on North Main Street in town, opposite the end of the common, opposite end of the common from where the church is. Jim had noticed that lately, over the past few months, on occasion, Mabel would wear an unusually heavy layer of makeup, especially around her eyes. Such was the case this morning. Jim wondered about that, but he was taken by surprise when he noticed to see that her husband Robert was right there behind her on that Sunday morning. Robert quickly grabs a bulletin and moves Mabel along into a pew which isn't where she usually sits, but further back behind everyone else. Well, there's Joe from Joe's Barber Shop. Well, Joe and his shop is the local source of news for Rock Haven. Every bit of it, of course, comes from reliable sources. Now, Joe's is one of those shops where fathers or grandfathers will bring their sons or grandsons to get their first haircut, where the talk is of local sports and NASCAR and fishing and the lobster catch. Joe is very clear that he is not one of those, what do they call them, hypercut shops like over in Pemberton in the strip mall. He's very clear that here he doesn't have what they call those fancy hairstylists. We're barbers here, and those hairstylists know their hair is a different color every week. Joe slaps Jim on the back and comments that it's about time to see him again, isn't it? Takes a bulletin and goes up and he sits right behind Jim. Next up the front steps comes Betsy and Carl Holbrook, who run the bakery and cafe. It's a great place to stop and grab a pastry or a sweet goodie and a cup of coffee. That is, if you like that fancy Starbucks-like Java. Jim, he prefers the more refined, familiar aroma and flavor of Maxwell House. Friends and neighbors make their way up the steps and into Jim's realm, Old First Church's vestibule. Jim greets them with the usual warmth and suitable intimacy that comes from living with a community for decades. Wait a minute. Who's that coming up the steps now? Is it? Looks like it is. Yes, it's that new family that just moved into the Hamptons' old place. Isn't he the one who works for that brokerage firm over in Uniondale? And Jim thought he understood that his wife was the new nurse practitioner at the Down East Medical Center. Sure, that's them. They have 3 children. The older 2 look like they're high schoolers, and they look like they're athletes. Football maybe, or volleyball. Look at them, all lined up coming up the steps. What a nice family. You know, we need more like them. Good income, add to the Sunday school and youth programs. He would be a good person to get on our board of finance. Let me see. Where can I see? Certainly not near Jed. What about with the Flanagans? No, that wouldn't work. What would a married couple do with a divorced single mom? I know. I'll see them in the pew. No, wait, I can't do that either. That's the Williams Ruth and our Herald. They always come in late. That's their pew. I'll put them right over here next to Jerome and Leslie Jordan. They seem to be of the same sort. And he directs them towards the Jordans. About this time, Jim hears a noise behind him, a shuffle of feet, and a hoarse, gravelly cough. Excuse me, what you got there, boss? Can I have one of those papers you've been giving to others? Fella ought to know the players if he's going to sit in on the game. Papers, Jim thinks to himself. Doesn't this person know they are called bulletins? Church bulletins? And this isn't a game, boss. Jim turns around and looks at him. Who is this guy? I don't know you. Quickly sizes up the fellow. His old sneakers look like at one point they might have been white. Worn blue jeans, well, at least there were no holes in them, but they're covered with oil stains. Long sleeve t-shirt that this fellow was using to obviously cover up tattoos that could be seen protruding under unbuttoned cuffs, and a 5 or 6 day growth of facial hair. And what did he do? Smells like he took a bath and aftershave, as if that's going to cover up the stench of his cigarettes. Jim handed him a bulletin. Thanks, boss. I need to get right with a fella upstairs. You think I'm in the right place? This new family was one thing. What am I going to do with this guy? Jim turns, steps around him to greet the next folks coming up the steps. Well, old Jim passed away last year. On his way to that glorious vestibule in the heavens, I'm sure he stopped by and gave the church one last look, and then shot right up through the beloved English Gothic steeple he stood guard under for all those years. Don't have any worries about Old First Church. Don't worry about it. Jim could see this day coming, and he groomed several replacements to keep a discerning eye over his beloved church and community. For one can't be too careful, you know. You never know. One of these days, Jesus might just show up, and we would want to look our best. Amen.